Yo, welcome to Six Layers, the comic signature show, period. I'm Mike the Six Layer, chilling with Mark the Honorable Villain. What up, fam?
What's up, Mike? Our next guest has some classics under his belt for both Marvel and DC. And more than once he's pitted those two titans against each other. Let him know who we got, Mike.
Joining us today, we have one of the legends in the game, writer Ron Marz. But before we chat with Ron, please like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and please comment. All right, our next guest is a sci-fi comics master. He's the creator of Parallax, Kyle Rayner, and he made Batman face off against the Aliens franchise. Ladies and gentlemen of the Stash Land, we bring to you the one and only writer, Ron Marz. How you doing, Ron?
I'm well, Mike. Good to see you. Good to see you too, Mark.
It's great to see you. We're going to just dive right on in. Well, Ron, since it's your first time joining us, we'd like to get your comic book origin story. In other words, how did you get your first gig in pro comics?
I got my first pro gig because Jim Starlin said, "Hey, you want to write comics?" And obviously that's a question you say yes to. And I've been literally doing it ever since. Jim was and is a friend. We, lived in the same area in the Hudson Valley in New York State. And we were just in the same social circle. I kind of fell in with Jim Starlin and Bernie Wrightson, Terry Austin, Joe Staten, the whole group that lived in that area, Kingston, Woodstock area in New York State. And I copy edited Jim's first novel for him when I was still in college, first prose novel, and was working at the local newspaper at the time. I was all of 21, 22 maybe. And, after I did the copy edit, Jim said, "Hey, you're pretty good at this. Do you want to try writing comics?" And, that's like, yeah, okay. Yes, sir. I would like to write comics. Jim took me by the hand and showed me how to do it and showed me around at Marvel, introduced me to people, and, co-wrote my first few scripts with me. Corrected the stuff that I got wrong and guided me on the path and then kind of, let me leave the nest. And I have literally been writing comics for 30 some years ever since. So basically I was in the right place at the right time and got lucky. That's the short version.
Shout out to Jim Starlin, man. Making legends happen. I love it. All right. So Ron, you started your career in the height of comic book sales. I mean, it would never happen the way it did in the 80s and the 90s. It never happened. I mean, never, ever, ever. Never, ever. So with that said, could you give us just a picture of how popular comics was in the 90s? Because I mean, you had one of the more popular titles for DC.
My first stuff was at Marvel. And I think the first royalty statement I got from Marvel for my first issue of Silver Surfer was 300,000 copies. Obviously, nothing sells 300,000 copies anymore, but that's what we sold every issue. So that was my introduction to this business, was the complete boom time. Where everything was selling because of speculation, because there was a bubble that obviously eventually burst. But that was my welcome into comics was, oh, by the way, your first issue ever sold 300,000 copies. It was a crazy time, and thankfully I had people like Starlin, like Wrightson, telling me this isn't going to last. This is, comics, the comic industry as a whole goes in waves and troughs, and you ride the waves when they're there and you survive the troughs when they're there. So I had a sense that, those kind of enormous sales and those kind of enormous royalties that went with it, were not a permanent fixture. This is not the way it was always going to be. So I was a little bit more open, a little bit more open-eyed about what this was actually going to work like than I think a lot of people who broke in around the same time as I did and did not have the benefit of, seasoned pros telling them this is how the whole business works. So I know guys who got crazy royalty checks and went out and bought, literally, Lamborghinis and just spent money like crazy because they didn't understand that this was a temporary situation. You got crazy royalties, and then in a few years you weren't getting those anymore. That the bubble burst, a lot of shops closed, orders went down, sales went down, and you went from making a lot of money to making a living. And the same dudes who bought the Lamborghinis had to give them back to the dealership because they couldn't afford them anymore.
Ron, can you tell us a little bit more about your experience writing Silver Surfer? What were some high points besides the royalty checks, and what were some challenging points that you faced during that run?
I was literally doing this when I was 22, 23 years old, so I was too dumb to really understand anything. I was just excited to do it. I probably should have had more stage fright than I did. And I probably should have been more nervous about it than I was. But, I just thought, well, it's Marvel Comics. I can do that. That's no big deal. So the whole thing was really on the job training. It was, I was getting paid to learn how to do the job while I was doing the job, because shortly after I broke in and did some Surfer stuff with Jim, he handed me the monthly Surfer book because he went off to do Infinity Gauntlet. Obviously that worked out for everybody involved. I was within, I don't know, probably a year, maybe a little less than a year, I was doing a monthly book, and a monthly book that was doing 15, 16 issues a year because everything was selling, so they wanted to get more books out on the stands. So, to me, it was just like I was a kid in a candy shop, and I wanted to try everything. So I was my first batch of issues, I was tasked with tying into a bunch of Infinity Gauntlet stories, which was ultimately, great training for how to work in a shared universe and how to deal with wrapping your story in and around other stories and making your story mean something, but not putting the lie to the main crossover that you were dealing with. It was all new and exciting to me. So I was really ready to jump into the deep end of the pool with both feet. In fairly short order, I left my job at the newspaper because, comics was lucrative and it was great. It was much more fun to make up that stuff than actually, what I was doing at the newspaper. So, fairly shortly after I graduated college, I was writing a monthly book at Marvel and working on other stuff like What If, and then within another year or two working on Thor, and just kind of working on whatever projects came my way.
Can you also tell us about the collaborative process with Ron Lim? Did you guys work in the traditional Marvel method, or was it more detailed scripts?
No, I wrote full scripts from the beginning of my career, really, because that's what Jim was doing, and he's the one that taught me how to do it. I've seen Marvel style scripts that were literally written on 2 cocktail napkins. That's that's not an exaggeration. You'd go out to lunch and have a lunch meeting, and the idea for the issue would get jotted down on 2 cocktail napkins, and they would hand it to the artist and say, "Here, you draw this." That was not the way I wanted to work. I wanted to have more input into what the visuals were going to be like, and I wanted to work more closely with the artist rather than just here's a story idea, you figure it out, and then I'll put dialogue in. So I wrote stuff full script, and then I would go back in and re-dialogue the pages after the art was turned in. But I am hugely thankful for working with Ron Lim, period, Then now, all in between, it's been a great relationship, and he's a close friend. But I'm really thankful that I worked with Ron at the beginning of my career, because he was really good. Still is really good, obviously. But he knew what he was doing. He was he was a really gifted storyteller, and I had the benefit of working with somebody who could translate what I was doing onto the page. And I think I knew I could do comics because I had a fairly visual imagination, and I could see the pages in my head. I can't draw to save my life. Like the stuff that's on the wall behind you, that is far beyond the scope of anything that I can do. So I can't draw, but I can see the pictures in my head. I can see what the page looks like in my mind, which is not to say that that's exactly what the artist is going to draw, nor do I expect them to. But I could visualize the page. And I have since realized, and I just figured everybody could do that, because I could. So I just figured, well, that's how people's brains work. And I, didn't take too long for me to realize, oh, not everybody can do that. Not everybody has that snapshot in their mind that they can describe. But I could. So I had a leg up on people learning to do this. So, but even so, working with Ron was just like, he could take what I was putting in the scripts and make it real, make it work on the page. Ultimately, the artwork on the page should tell the story with no text on it, right? You should be able to understand what's going on in the story just by looking at the page. That was drilled into my head by Jim, and certainly that was supported by Ron doing what he does, because I would get the pages back, and that's still the most magical part of this whole process. Is you take the thing that's in your head and funnel it to an artist, and then it comes back made real. It's still the irreplaceable part of this whole process, is the thing that existed only in your mind comes back on a page that makes it real.
That is fantastic. Let's talk about another great artist you worked with, the late great Bernie Wrightson. You two worked together on a major crossover, Aliens and Batman, in a beautiful prestige format. It was, back when they were, cranking those out. Could you explain a little bit of the collaborative process between you and Bernie?
Yeah, I would go down to his house a mile down the road and hang out. Yeah, when Bernie and I did that, he was literally living a mile or maybe a mile and a half down the road. He had actually helped me find a house to rent on the same road, like back in the woods across from him, perched on a cliff overlooking the whole Hudson Valley. It was amazing. And then, not too long after, a house started being built a little further down the road, a new construction, and we ended up buying that house as the first house we bought. So I was literally, a short walk from Bernie's house. So I would go down and hang out. We'd hang out in his studio back behind the house, and when we worked on something, I would go to the studio, which was actually a former chicken coop. The foundation of it had been a chicken coop years before, and when Bernie moved in, had studio built back there, and it was big. It was 40 by 60, maybe even bigger than that. But it was its own separate building, and filled with, basically filled with what Frankenstein's lab looks like in his Frankenstein portfolios, just filled floor to ceiling with all sorts of cool stuff, shark fetuses and bottles and full-size skeletons and old tin toys and you name it, with Bernie's big ass drawing board in the middle of it. So when we worked on Batman Aliens, I would just go down to the studio and hang out with him, and we'd go over the layouts while I was sitting there having a beer and and he was, he would be sketching stuff. And I mean, obviously, like, I look back on it now, and that's magical. That's irreplaceable with a master like Bernie. But he was just my buddy Bernie who lived down the road. I would have to kind of remind myself that, that guy that I go get pizza and beer with is Bernie Wrightson. It was very much you sort of had two versions of him in your mind, because we just hang out, and then it would be like I'd go down and look at finished pages, and I'm like, holy shit, that's Bernie Wrightson. That's like this stuff that was in my head is now has come out of him onto the page. So the book was fairly collaborative. We kind of came up with a concept while I think we were coming back from New York City. He was driving, and we were just kicking around ideas for what we could do, and what we could do together. And Bernie said, "Hey, how about Batman Aliens?" And I went, "Well, they'll never let us do that. That's not a thing." But we said, let's ask. Let's at least ask what the possibilities are. And Bernie called Dark Horse, and they went, "Oh, that's a really good idea. We'll ask 20th Century Fox, and we'll ask DC." And to our shock, everybody said yes. And then we had to come up with a story, because we didn't really have a story beyond, Batman should meet the aliens. So and then it became a question of, me saying to Bernie, "What do you want to draw, and what do you not want to draw?" And Bernie was, he wanted to draw aliens, and he didn't want to draw buildings, and he didn't want to draw cars. So that's why it's set in the jungle, and why it's set in Mayan ruins, because I don't know that there's a straight edge in that whole book. So but that's part of your job as a comic writer, is to tailor the story to what your artist is going to enjoy the most and have the most fun doing. Yeah, I think that was the first sort of superhero alien crossover, and obviously it spawned a bunch of other encounters with all sorts of different heroes and predators and all of that stuff, and now we'll never do it again, because 20th Century Fox is under the Disney umbrella, and they'll only meet Marvel characters now.
Ron, you had significant stints for both publishers, DC and Marvel. Were there any differences in how the two companies operated from your experience, as far as just the way they operated in general?
Not really. I mean, I didn't find a lot of difference. I mostly the differences that I perceived were different editors, and it just happened. It didn't really have anything to do with a company philosophy. It was just like how you clicked with a particular editor on a particular staff. DC was always a little bit more professional and buttoned down, and Marvel was more loosey-goosey and a little bit more of a frat house in terms of how they conducted themselves. But ultimately, I mean, I had good experiences at both, and still have good experiences at both. But I mean, that was really the only difference. Was Marvel was just sort of a little, a little more brash, a little more let's have fun. And at DC, it was the house that Superman built. It was a little bit more like the DC heroes were your parent superheroes in some ways, because they had been around much longer, and the Marvel heroes felt like the superheroes for your generation, because they were more, they had humanized problems. They had, they were much more like you, as opposed to the more iconic DC characters, and which is not a judgment on either one. I think those sets of characters work beautifully as they are, but there was just a little bit of a difference in the outlook of the characters, I think, and that came through in the storytelling, and it should.
Ron, you also have experience for Image, coming up with Homage Studios writing Stormwatch. Can you compare the experience for Image in those old days to working for the major publishers in the 90s?
I mean, that was probably the real frat house example. Is it was just, to a certain extent, it was the inmates running the asylum. It was, it was mostly writers and artists, making decisions, and just kind of, you could do whatever you wanted. There was really nobody to answer to except, the Image founders who were sort of running the whole thing. And then, little by little, an editorial structure was brought in, and mostly by bringing in former Marvel and DC editors to kind of try to manage the process a little bit more, and stay on schedule more, and be a little bit more professional than things were when they started out. I did stuff obviously for Top Cow for years. I did stuff for Homage, which turned into Wildstorm. So I sort of danced with all those partners, and it was all great. It was all a lot of fun. Obviously, they were very artist-oriented companies, particularly at the beginning. It was a bunch of artists who had, walked away from Marvel when they couldn't work out what they thought was fair compensation, and walked away at exactly the right time when the boom was on, and did comics like they wanted to do them. And obviously the market responded in a huge way. All of those books sold millions of copies, which led to making vast money every month for those companies, because they were producing books. They were producing books every month, or if they weren't sticking to schedules, not quite every month. But then it became apparent that, oh my God, there's a lot of money to be made here if we can just put these books out on time. So it was a good time, and it was a lot of fun. And I got brought in fairly early on to do various and sundry things at Homage / Wildstorm, Stormwatch, some minis. I was actually supposed to take over Wildcats, but then some guy named Alan Moore decided he wanted to do it, and they went with him instead. That was probably the right choice. So it was interesting to be in that mix at the time, because the stories had been so artist oriented, and now the idea was that they wanted to have a bit more story structure, a bit more traditional storytelling involved, so that it wasn't just eye candy, so that it wasn't just cool pinups of heroes gnashing their teeth. It was that there was a story there every month to bring you back. And so in that respect, it was very cool, because you were valued for help us bring some structure to what we're doing, and work with the artists, and make a concerted effort to turn what we're doing into memorable storytelling, not just memorable art.
Okay, so you said millions of copies with Image. I was about to ask you a question. What version of Image was bigger, today or yesteryear? But clearly today, they're not cranking out millions of copies. So could you share a little bit more, or elaborate a little bit more about just the scope of how big Image was as a new company?
Yeah, initially, it wasn't like there weren't a lot of titles. I mean, obviously Image now produces much more in terms of a diversity of titles. When Image started back then, it was basically everybody's version of the X-Men, right? Wildcats was the X-Men, Cyberforce was the X-Men, Youngblood was the X-Men, just not drawn very well. So it was, everybody was doing what they knew how to do and what was selling. So those books were obviously pretty imitative of what ruled the roost at the time, which was still X-Men.
Let's talk about your introduction of Kyle Rayner. Did DC bring you in on Green Lantern to create him to replace Hal Jordan?
Yeah, when DC offered me Green Lantern, I had actually been down at Marvel's offices for the day. I think it was a Thursday night, and I got back to I got back to my house down the road from Bernie Wrightson, and I got a call from DC in the evening saying, "Oh, we want to talk to you about something." And the something turned out to be, "Do you want to take over Green Lantern?" And I was like, "That sounds cool. I like that. I like that Hal Jordan costume that Gil Kane created, and I like the whole Wright stuff, fighter pilot kind of vibe." And they're like, "Oh yeah, well, hang on, we're doing something different." And then they explained to me what they wanted to do with Emerald Twilight was basically move Hal out of the lead role of the series and then create a new one. So it was obviously it was like, oh, that's a big thing. That's not just just tell the next story. That's a complete change in how the franchise is going to work. And obviously I said yes. And then so Emerald Twilight is basically the story that they asked me to tell with they gave me like a page and a half of notes, like here are the broad strokes of the story, you fill in the rest. And then I got to create Kyle from whole cloth without really much direction from DC. They just let me and Daryl come up with the name, the look, the background on him, and just kind of went, yep, that looks good. And we were off and running. Now again, I was still fairly young, and I didn't realize what an opportunity this was, and frankly, how much pressure there was to get this right. And we didn't have a lot of time. I mean, we were up against the deadline because they had already started to work on a different version of issues 48, 49, and 50 that obviously never saw print with the previous team. So we had to hit the ground running, and we didn't look back. We just we were fortunate enough to have DC trust us enough to just go do this thing. And I'm sure if we had come up with something that they weren't comfortable with, we would have heard about it. But Kyle just was, he's kind of what you see is what we came up with.
Ron, you brought a new meaning to cold cuts, man. When the way Kyle's girlfriend was killed, Alex in Emerald Twilight. And I just want to know, was that your idea? Was that Daryl's idea? And what was was there any backlash?
No, that was my idea. You can blame me, not Daryl. He was just a good soldier. Oh yeah, there was a lot more backlash about what happened to Hal initially than there was about what happened to Alex, which is probably indicative of where we were as a society then and where we are as a society now. But there was some furor because people didn't see it coming. Like the people did not expect someone that we had sort of hopefully built into a likable supporting character was going to get killed before the first year of the run was out. That was always the intention. I mean, I always knew that was going to happen because I wanted the stakes to be serious. I wanted I wasn't like getting a Green Lantern ring isn't winning the lottery. There's a huge amount of responsibility that goes with it, and if you don't do the job correctly, people around you pay the price. So that was always the intention, but we made sure that we had built Alex's character so that essentially you should have liked her more than you liked Kyle at that point. Like she was responsible. She was smarter than he was. And she's the one that ends up paying the price for it. So I knew that was going to be her fate, but I think when that issue came out, there was kind of a gasp, a collective gasp. But we got a lot more death threats over Hal Jordan being removed from the book than we did for killing Kyle's girlfriend.
Ron, you also introduced Parallax, which was originally Hal's dark path to villainy. Today, Parallax is the sentient embodiment of fear. Can you tell us your impressions of Jeff Johns' Green Lantern and how he evolved your classic storylines?
Jeff and I are friends, and that's just how comics works. It's the team that comes after you, whether it's directly after or years down the road, builds on what you did, and ultimately you don't. It's not yours. I understand that neither Kyle nor Parallax, are not my toys. They're DC's toys. I had a large hand in creating both of them, but they're ultimately not mine. And you have to be okay with that, or you really can't work in a shared universe. I told the Parallax stories that I wanted to tell, and Jeff came in and did something different that turned out to be really popular too. So I don't have any problems with it because I'm an adult and I understand that's what the job is. I wish he wasn't a cloud in the movie, but I think that's probably a fairly universal opinion on that one.
Definitely.
So, Ron, friction aside, how big of an impact was Emerald Twilight on your career?
Well, big, I guess. I mean, I'm still here, so that says something. No, it was a big deal, and I didn't realize how big a deal it was going to be until it was all sort of happening. But it was also, it was pre-internet, so it was pre-internet and pre sort of culture in general discovering comics. It was pre, MCU, and it was comics were still just comics at that point for the most part. Now comics are a part of the cultural fabric like they were not then. So yeah, it was a big deal for the time. I think it would be an even bigger deal now because we're so plugged into social media and comics get treated like all other forms of storytelling. So it was a big deal within the comic world, but outside of the comic world, nobody gave a shit because nobody was aware. Yeah, I mean, certainly it made a big impression in my career because everybody was reading the book, and it sold a bunch of copies, and it was the thing that everybody was talking about for that period of time. And I think we managed to bring a bunch of new readers to DC. Not that the plan was to have those issues be kind of a ground floor read for people who weren't reading DC books at all, but it kind of turned into that because it was a brand new character. It was a storyline that a lot of people were talking about, and it was also my first DC monthly, so I was anxious to play with all the toys. I wanted to write Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman and explore different ends of the DC universe because it was my first time exploring all that stuff. So it just all sort of dovetailed into a year or two that was really welcoming to brand new readers.
How hard was it to get together the Marvel versus DC crossover, and do you think that could ever happen again?
It wasn't hard to put it together because everybody was in agreement. I was picked to write it along with Peter David, and obviously that's not a thing that you say no to. And that came about. Marvel vs. DC came about because that industry bubble had burst. The speculation boom and hoarding copies and all of the cover gimmicks, which that's come full circle again.
Preach.
But the holographic covers and foil covers and all of that stuff that had sort of artificially inflated sales, that all burst at Valiant books that were way over ordered, sat in cases in the storerooms of comic shops. A lot of Marvel and DC books that were big deals, holofoils and polybagged and Return of Superman and all of that stuff that everybody was counting on to be a huge deal, much like Death of Superman, that had all sorts of people who hadn't looked at a comic in 20 years coming into comic shops and buying 10 copies. Like that couldn't continue. And when that bubble burst, and shops were suddenly sitting on case upon case of unsold books and had overextended themselves financially, shops started to close. It was a grim time in comics. So Marvel and DC wanted to do something to try to keep comic shops open, because obviously that's part of the circle of life. If there are no comic shops selling comics, Marvel and DC are out of business. And so Marvel versus DC was put together at a time when the two companies were getting along well with each other, but also needed each other. They were both very well aware that they needed to do something to get books into shops that people would be excited about, would come in and buy, and would put money in cash registers for shops and keep them open. So that's where Marvel versus DC came from, along with the amalgam books that sort of spawned out of Marvel versus DC. And that was, again, a situation where, okay, we're going to do this thing and we got to go now. We got to hit the ground running. So it was very much, I got a call from Mike Carlin at DC, and he said, do you want to do this thing? And obviously you say yes. And I think like the next week we were having a meeting at Mark Grunwald's apartment in New York City, because they didn't want us, Mark Grunwald being the editor from Marvel, neither company wanted meetings going on at their offices, because like, well, why are those guys here? What are they talking about? And so they didn't want word to get out. And so I think the next week we had a meeting, and the next week I was working on the first script. So it was a quick turnaround. And, the idea was, let's do a big deal series that's going to get everybody excited, get readers involved, and get people back into comic shops. So all of the, obviously we were using all of the characters, so all of the editors were involved in terms of approving what was going on with their characters and all that. And they were all told, look, this is a big, fun popcorn event. Don't nitpick stuff. So in that sense, it was all very easy. Like nobody pushed back on much of anything. And like, we also understood the job. Like, Batman's going to fight Captain America. Like, you're not reinventing the wheel here. You're doing an intercompany crossover, and superheroes are going to have fisticuffs with each other.
Last question. Is there anything that we haven't discussed that you want the fans to know about? Any upcoming projects, any appearances that you're going to have throughout the next year?
Well, let's see. A bunch. I'm booked for shows next year. I will be overseas in January, but that hasn't been announced yet. And then there's more shows booked for next year that haven't been announced yet. Let's see, what else? The 0 Hour 30th anniversary special just came out end of last month, or end of August, maybe? I'm not sure. So Dan Jurgens and I just put that together for DC. It was a lot of fun. My first issue of Savage Sword of Conan came out same day, in fact. So there's more Savage Sword stuff coming up. There's a Top Cow book coming up that hasn't been announced yet. There's other stuff. There's other irons in the fire that have not been announced. And I also work on the Diablo franchise for Blizzard. And we just literally earlier this week, we released the first expansion for Diablo 4, which is called Vessel of Hatred, which I worked extensively on. So it's kind of cool. I mean, it's a whole different, video games are a whole different thing than comics, because the gestation period is so much longer. Like, we've been working on this expansion for almost 2 years. So the time frame is much longer, and the release is a much bigger deal. Whereas comics are, you grind it out every month, and you put an issue to bed, and then you start right in on the next one, and the train just keeps going down the track. So I find it really enjoyable to be working on both ends of it. They're different experiences, but ultimately it's all storytelling. It's all video games. You get to participate and everybody moves. And in comics, it's just single images, but it's all visual storytelling and it's all character driven stories. It's the jobs are different, but they're the same.
Ron, thank you so much for joining us, man. This has been a treat, man. This was a deep dive into a lot of our favorite stories from your career. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, guys. My pleasure. We'll do it again.
Well, that's all for our show. If you like what you see, please subscribe and hit the like button. This is Six Layers. I'm Mike, speaking for Mark and Ron Marz. We are out. Peace.
6